New here at 4, former Clipper and Artesia High School star James Harden was arrested this morning in Houston. Court records show the 36-year-old is being charged with a misdemeanor, unlawful carrying of a weapon after officers saw a gun sitting on the seat of his vehicle. Harden was booked and released on a $100 bond. Representatives for Harden didn't immediately return messages to ESPN. The LA native is currently with the Cleveland Cavaliers after a midseason trade.
Just weeks ago, James Harden was on the floor of an Eastern Conference Finals, one of the greatest scorers the game has ever produced, still chasing the championship that's eluded him for 17 seasons. Weeks later, at 3:41 inches the morning, he was being booked into a Harris County jail, not in Cleveland, not in Los Angeles. In Houston, the city that built his legend, fingerprinted and photographed on a weapons charge. Here's what makes it strange. In Texas, James Harden was allowed to have that gun, allowed to carry it, allowed to keep it in the car with him. There is one rule, one technical line buried in the state's gun law, and that single detail is the reason a future Hall of Famer spent his Saturday morning behind bars instead of in front of a camera. We'll get to exactly what that detail was. But first, how a routine traffic stop on a downtown street at 3 in the morning became the most talked about arrest in basketball this week. To understand why this arrest sent a jolt through the basketball world, you have to understand who James Harden is. For most of the last decade, he wasn't just good. He was, statistically, one of the most unstoppable offensive players the league had ever seen. The beard, the step-back three, the 2018 Most Valuable Player, an 11-time All-Star, a 3-time scoring champion who, for 3 straight seasons, averaged close to 34 points a night, a stretch that puts him in the same breath as the greatest pure scorers in NBA history. He came into the league in 2009, the 3rd overall pick out of Arizona State, drafted by the Oklahoma City Thunder. But it was Houston that turned him into a superstar, 9 seasons with the Rockets. His prime, his MVP, the city where he became James Harden the franchise, the face, the man whose game defined an entire era of Houston basketball. And that's what makes the location of this story matter. Because James Harden wasn't arrested in some city he was passing through. He was arrested at home in the place that built his legend, the place he still comes back to every single offseason. The timing is its own kind of cruel. Just weeks before that 3 traffic stop, Harden's season had ended in about the harshest way it could. Now, with the Cleveland Cavaliers, the team that traded for him mid-season, in a deal that sent Darius Garland the other way, he'd finally clawed back to an Eastern Conference Finals. He was 4 wins from the one thing that has eluded him for his entire career. 17 seasons, a first-ballot Hall of Fame resume, and not a single championship to show for any of it. The Cavaliers didn't just lose, they were swept, 4 straight, by the New York Knicks, a team that would go on to play for its first title since 1973. For a player chasing a legacy-defining ring, there's almost no worse way for it to end. So when this happened, Harden wasn't mid-season, mid-spotlight. He was in the quiet, raw weeks right after one of the most disappointing exits of his career back home in Houston. Out of the playoffs, out of the headlines. At least until that Saturday morning. Here's what we know about that night, according to police and court records. In the early hours of Saturday, Harden had reportedly been out at a hookah lounge in Houston with a large group of friends. Sources who spoke to the New York Post described it as an ordinary off-season night, a famous athlete, in his own city, surrounded by people he knows. Sometime around 3 in the morning, that group left in a small convoy of vehicles, moving through downtown Houston. Harden was behind the wheel of one of them, and then, on a downtown street near 1800 Crawford, the convoy crossed paths with the Houston Police Department. According to a police spokesperson, officers initially pulled the group over for a traffic violation. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because the stop did not begin as a manhunt, or a response to a shooting, or anything to do with James Harden at all. It started as one of the most routine things that happens in any city. Every night, a traffic stop in the dark. But during that stop, an officer approached one of the vehicles. The driver identified himself. It was James Harden. And inside that vehicle, police say, in plain view, was a handgun. Now, this is the part most people get wrong the first time they hear this story. Because the instinct is to assume Harden did something obviously, flagrantly illegal, that he was hiding a weapon, that he had no right to it. He wasn't, and he did. In Texas, a person is generally allowed to carry a handgun in their own vehicle loaded without any permit at all. On its face, simply having a gun in your car is not a crime in this state. So how does a legally owned gun in one of the most permissive carry states in the entire country end up putting one of the most famous athletes alive into a Harris County jail cell? The answer comes down to a single line in the law, one specific condition that has to be met. And on this night, according to the complaint, that one condition wasn't. We'll lay out exactly what that condition is and why it turned a non-crime into a criminal charge in just a moment. Because here's what makes this bigger than a one-night embarrassment. Harden was booked at 3:41 a.m. on a single misdemeanor count of unlawfully carrying a weapon and released a short time later on a $100 bond. $100. On paper, it's about as low level as a charge gets. But the conditions attached to his release tell a more serious story. Harden was barred from possessing any weapon, barred from drinking alcohol, barred from using drugs, and ordered to submit to urine testing, the kind of supervision courts impose to keep tabs on someone between arrest and trial. He's now due in court on June 22 for arraignment, and it's all landing at the worst possible moment in an offseason where he was reportedly expected to sign a contract extension with Cleveland. His next chapter suddenly tangled up in a downtown traffic stop, and one question that still hasn't been answered. How did that gun end up the way it did? And was it really as simple as the law makes it sound? So here's the line in the law, the single technical detail we promised you at the very start. Under Texas Penal Code, Section 46.02, a person commits an offense if they carry a handgun in plain view inside a vehicle they own or control unless they're at least 21 or licensed, and the handgun is carried in a holster. Read that again, because everything turns on it. It isn't illegal to have the gun. It isn't illegal to have it loaded. It isn't even illegal to have it sitting out where you can see it. Even after Texas loosened its carry laws in 2021, one rule survived. If a handgun is visible in your vehicle, it has to be in a holster. Conceal it in a console, a glove box, a bag legal. Holster it on your hip legal, but leave it loose and exposed, and that same legal gun becomes a criminal charge. And according to the complaint, that's exactly the situation James Harden was in. Court records say the handgun in his vehicle was in plain view and was not carried in a holster. One outlet, citing sources, described it bluntly: an open gun sitting in the cup holder of his car. That's it. That's the difference between James Harden driving home from a night out and James Harden being booked into Harris County Jail at 3:41 in the morning. Not a holster. A few inches of leather or nylon that, in the eyes of Texas law, is the entire boundary between lawful and unlawful. It almost sounds too small to be real. A future Hall of Famer, a man who has earned hundreds of millions of dollars, brought into a jail over the placement of a gun he was otherwise completely entitled to own. But that's the nature of this specific offense. Defense attorneys who handle these cases will tell you the most common version of an unlawful carry charge in Texas isn't some hardened criminal. It's an otherwise law-abiding person whose handgun was improperly stored or visible in a vehicle. If the gun is in plain view, the rule is simple. Officers will arrest for unlawful carrying unless it's in a holster. And that brings us to the part of this story that's easy to miss. Because there's a second condition buried in that same law, one that has nothing to do with holsters at all. Under the statute, the vehicle exception doesn't apply if the person is engaged in criminal activity. Now, an ordinary traffic violation doesn't count against you. But the moment a separate offense is in play, the calculus around that gun can shift fast. So what actually happened that night? According to a Houston police spokesperson, Harden was pulled over around 3 a.m. for some kind of traffic violation on a downtown roadway. By some accounts, he was driving in a group of vehicles, and it was another driver in that group who first drew the officer's attention. When police approached Harden's car, he identified himself, and he was taken into custody for unlawful carrying of a weapon. And crucially, Harden reportedly confirmed that the gun was his. That confirmation matters. In a case that hinges on whether a specific person knowingly carried a specific weapon, An admission of ownership removes one of the questions a defense might otherwise raise. But before anyone writes this off as an open and shut case, understand how much is still unresolved. This is a misdemeanor. Harden was released after posting a $100 bond, and he is scheduled to be arraigned on June 22. An arraignment is not a trial. It's the formal start of the process, the point at which a defendant is told the charge against them and enters a plea. Nothing has been proven, no verdict has been reached. James Harden at this moment stands accused, not convicted. And cases like this have real defenses, whether the gun was truly in plain view or partially concealed, whether the stop and search were conducted properly, whether the elements of the statute can actually be met. For a man with the resources to mount a serious legal defense, a low-level misdemeanor is the kind of charge that often gets negotiated, reduced, or dismissed long before it ever sees a courtroom. So why does any of this matter if the legal stakes are so low? Because the other stakes aren't low at all. The conditions attached to Harden's release read less like a parking ticket and more like genuine court supervision. He was barred from possessing weapons, barred from drugs or alcohol, and ordered to submit to urine testing while the case is pending. And the timing could hardly be worse. This is the same offseason in which Harden is reportedly expected to sign a contract extension with the Cleveland Cavaliers, a franchise that, the morning of the arrest, said only that it was aware of the situation, in contact with Harden and his representation, and would have no further comment. A misdemeanor on paper. But for a 36-year-old chasing the final chapter of a Hall of Fame career, a 3 a.m., booking photo in the city that made him is the kind of thing that follows a name far longer than a $100 bond suggests. Which leaves one question hanging over everything that comes next, and it's not really a legal one at all. So here's where the story looks like it ends. A misdemeanor, a $100 bond, booked at 4:57 inches the morning, released a short time later. A gun he was almost entirely entitled to own, undone by a holster he didn't use. For a man of Harden's resources, this is the kind of charge that lawyers make disappear, negotiated down, deferred, or dismissed before it ever reaches a jury. On paper, the legal exposure is close to the floor. Case closed. Right? Not quite, because the courtroom was never where the real stakes lived. While everyone was focused on the arraignment date, two very different clocks started ticking, and neither of them runs on a judge's schedule. The first is a contract. Harden just finished his 17th NBA season, and he's sitting on one of the most consequential decisions of his career. He holds a player option worth roughly $42 million to return to the Cavaliers next season. But that number hides a trap. Of that $42 million, only about $13.3 million is actually guaranteed, and he has until June 29 to decide whether to pick it up or decline it and test free agency. Sit with that timeline for a second. He was arrested on June 13. His arraignment is June 22. His contract decision is due June 29. 3 of the biggest dates of his professional year, stacked inside 16 days, and a fresh booking photo dropped right in the middle of all of them. What makes it sharper is that Harden had already made his intentions clear. Definitely want to be here? He told reporters when Cleveland's season ended. It's tough ending it, not how we wanted to, but I think we found something. A player publicly signaling he wants to stay, on a partially guaranteed deal, while a misdemeanor charge hangs over his name that's not a closed chapter. That's a negotiation suddenly playing out under a spotlight nobody asked for. And then there's the second clock. The one most people forget exists. A criminal case and a league investigation are not the same thing, and they don't move together. The NBA has its own conduct standards, its own internal review process, and its own power to discipline entirely separate from whatever a Texas court decides. As several outlets have noted, any league or team discipline would depend on both the outcome of the case and the NBA's own review of it. Here's why that matters. A player can have a charge dismissed and still face league discipline, because the league isn't asking, is he guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? It's asking a much broader question about conduct. The legal bar and the league bar are different bars. And the NBA has shown, specifically with James Harden, that it's willing to act. In 2023, the league fined Harden $100,000 over public comments about his contract situation in Philadelphia. a fine the players' union openly disputed and moved to challenge. That was a business dispute, not a criminal matter, and the circumstances couldn't be more different. But it establishes something simple. This is not a player the league hesitates to discipline when it decides a line has been crossed. So now look at what's actually unresolved. The holster technicality, the device this whole story has turned on, may well end the legal case quickly. A skilled defense can challenge whether the gun was truly in plain view, whether the stop and search were clean, whether the elements of the statute can even be proven. That part could be over fast. But the holster doesn't touch the contract clock. It doesn't touch the league review. And it doesn't touch the part that no ruling can undo the optics. The bond conditions alone, no firearms, no alcohol, random urinalysis until the court date are the kind of supervision that reads very differently in a headline than $100 misdemeanor does. For a 36-year-old in the final act of a Hall of Fame career, in the exact window where he's deciding his future and his team is deciding his value, perception isn't a footnote, it's leverage. That's the false floor this story keeps offering and then pulling away. It's nothing, it's a misdemeanor. And technically, legally, that may be true. But legally minor and consequence-free are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where the real story lives. Because the man who walked out of Harris County Jail on a $100 bond didn't walk back into a normal off-season. He walked into a 16-day stretch where a courtroom, a front office, and a league office are all quietly watching the same name at the same time. And not one of those three has shown its hand yet. Before we get to what happens next, the arraignment, the plea, the decision that could reshape the back end of his career, one quick thing. If you're the kind of person who wants the full picture on stories like this one, the cases, the headlines flatten into a single sentence, the law underneath the noise, that's exactly what this channel exists for. Subscribe and you won't miss the follow-up when Harden walks into that courtroom on the 22nd, because this story isn't over. It's barely started. Now here's the part that makes the James Harden arrest bigger than James Harden. Because the truth is, what happened to him on that downtown street happens to ordinary Texans constantly. The only difference is that their booking photos don't trend. Texas is one of the most permissive states in the country when it comes to carrying a firearm. In 2021, the state passed permitless carry, dramatically loosening the rules on who could carry a handgun and where. For a lot of people, the takeaway was simple and absolute. I live in Texas. I can have my gun. And in a vehicle, that's largely true. You don't need a license, and you don't need to keep it unloaded. But one rule survived the loosening. Even after 2021, it remains a crime in Texas to have a handgun visible in your car, unless that handgun is in a holster. That's the entire trap. The law didn't say no guns. It said not like that. And the gap between what people think the law allows and what it actually requires is exactly where cases like Harden's are born. Listen to how the attorneys who handle these cases describe them. The most common version of an unlawful carrying charge in Texas isn't a dangerous criminal. It's an otherwise law-abiding person whose handgun was improperly stored or sitting in plain view inside a vehicle. If the gun is out on the seat or visible from outside the car, that's plain view, and it's a charge unless it's holstered. Tuck it in a console, a glove box, a bag, legal. Leave it in the cup holder, and you've crossed a line you may not even have known was there. Think about how easy that is to do. You're a lawful gun owner. You're allowed to carry. You've done nothing violent, nothing threatening. You simply set your firearm down where you could reach it. And then a taillight's out, or you roll a stop sign, and a routine traffic stop puts an officer at your window looking straight at a weapon the law says had to be wearing a holster. At that point, officers will generally arrest for unlawful carrying unless the gun is holstered. Not because of who you are, because of where the gun was sitting. And there's a second tripwire in the same statute, one that quietly raises the stakes for everyone. The vehicle exception falls apart if the person is engaged in criminal activity, anything beyond a minor traffic offense. So the moment any other issue enters the picture during a stop, the calculus around that gun can shift fast. A situation that was a technicality a second ago can become something heavier. This is what makes the Harden case resonate past the sports page. Strip away the fame, and what's left is one of the most ordinary legal stories in Texas. A person who was allowed to own a gun, allowed to carry it, allowed to have it in the car undone by a rule about presentation that thousands of drivers in that state don't fully understand. The statute draws its line precisely there. Visible plus unholstered equals an offense. Everything on the other side of that line is legal. And here's the uncomfortable equalizer in all of it. In front of that one specific line, James Harden, a former MVP, a future Hall of Famer, a man worth a fortune, stood in exactly the same position as a commuter on his way home from a night shift. The same statute, the same plain view rule, the same holster that wasn't there. His resume bought him a better legal defense and a faster bond. It didn't buy him an exemption, which is the real reason this story refuses to die quietly. It isn't just that a famous athlete got arrested, it's that his arrest is a spotlight on a law most people only learn about the hard way at 3 in the morning, at the side of a road, with a flashlight pointed into the place they left their gun. So when Harden walks into that Harris County courtroom, he won't just be answering for one night and one cup holder. He'll be standing inside a system that turns a few inches of leather into the line between a law-abiding citizen and a criminal defendant, a system that's already pulled in countless people whose names you'll never hear. And that's the version of this story the headline never tells you. So what actually happens on June 22? Most people hear arraignment and picture a verdict. It isn't. An arraignment is simply the hearing where a defendant is formally told the charge against them and enters a plea. It's the starting line, not the finish. Nothing is decided that day, except how the fight begins. And for a charge like this one, there are several ways the fight can go, most of which never end in the word guilty. Start with the charge itself. Unlawful carrying of a weapon is most commonly charged as a Class A misdemeanor, which carries a theoretical penalty of up to a year in county jail, a fine of up to $4,000, or both. On paper, that sounds serious. In practice, for a first-time defendant with no violent history, that ceiling is almost never where these cases land. Probation, deferred adjudication, and pretrial diversion are routinely available for first-time offenders. And first-time UCW cases are frequently resolved through diversion or deferred adjudication, especially when the underlying traffic stop or search is weak. Here's where it gets interesting, and where the device we planted at the very beginning comes back one last time. The single most powerful thing a defense attorney can do in a case like this is attack the foundation. A skilled lawyer can push for outright dismissal when the stop or the search was unlawful, when the vehicle carry exemption applies, or when the weapon wasn't actually on or about the person. Think about what that means. The holster technicality, the very detail that created this charge, is also the terrain where it could be unraveled. Was the gun truly in plain view or partially obscured? Was the stop clean? Does the car carry exemption reach this exact set of facts? The case was born on a narrow line, and it could die on that same narrow line. But let's say it doesn't get dismissed. Let's say it resolves the way many first-time cases do. Even then, the outcomes are not all the same, and the differences matter enormously. Pretrial diversion doesn't require a guilty plea at all. Complete the program, and the charge is dismissed. For first-time offenders, it's a path that can let someone avoid a criminal record entirely. That's the cleanest possible exit. Deferred adjudication is different. It requires a guilty or no contest plea up front. The case is dismissed after the supervision period, but that plea and the record of it doesn't simply evaporate. And this is where one of the most persistent myths in Texas law gets dangerous. Defense attorneys will tell you the number one misconception people have is finish your deferred and the offense disappears. It doesn't work that way. Even with deferred adjudication, the arrest itself remains on the record. Sit with that, because it reframes this entire story. Whatever happens in that courtroom, diversion, deferred, even a clean dismissal, the booking photo already exists. The arrest already happened. The record of being taken into custody doesn't vanish just because the charge does. For an ordinary person, that's a quiet burden carried on a background check. For one of the most recognizable athletes alive, it's a permanent line in a public biography. The legal system can dismiss a charge. It cannot unring a bell that rang in every sports headline in the country. And that brings us to the second calendar, the one that doesn't care what a judge decides at all. Because while the legal clock runs toward June 22, the basketball clock is running toward June 29. That's Harden's deadline to decide whether to exercise his roughly $42 million player option, of which only about $13 million is guaranteed or decline it and enter free agency. Two of the most consequential decisions of his year, one legal and one financial, separated by 7 days. And they don't run on the same logic. A courtroom asks whether a statute was violated. A front office asks something colder: what is this man worth now? And what does this headline do to that number? Those two questions can have completely different answers. Harden could walk out of that arraignment with a path to a clean record and still find that the arrest reshaped his leverage in a negotiation. The law can forgive a technicality in a way that a market never quite does. So here's the honest state of this story, stripped of all the noise. A future Hall of Famer was arrested over the placement of a gun he was allowed to own. The charge is minor. The legal exposure is small. The most likely outcomes don't involve a jury or a cell. But minor was never the same as meaningless. Not when the arrest survives the dismissal, not when the photo outlives the verdict, and not when the calendar has stacked his reckoning with the courts and his reckoning with his career inside the same 8 days. 2 clocks, one name, and as of right now, neither clock has finished running. Step back from the legal language for a moment and look at what this story actually is. A few weeks ago, James Harden was standing on the floor of an Eastern Conference Finals chasing, at 36 years old, the one prize that has escaped him for an entire Hall of Fame career. 17 seasons, a scoring title 3 times over, an MVP, and never, not once, a championship. He came that close, and then watched his team get swept off the floor by the New York Knicks. And weeks later, in the dark, on a downtown street in the city that made him, he was sitting in the back of a process he couldn't outscore booked at 3:41 in the morning over a handgun that, in almost every respect, he was completely allowed to have. That's the contradiction this whole story lives inside. Not a villain, not a shooting, not a spree. A future Hall of Famer undone by a few inches of leather that weren't there, a holster, the single thing standing between a lawful gun owner and a criminal defendant in the state of Texas. What makes this land harder than a typical celebrity arrest is when it arrived. This isn't a 22-year-old stumble, the kind a long career quietly absorbs and forgets. This is a complication that showed up in the final chapter at the precise moment Harden is deciding what the end of his career even looks like. He said he wants to stay in Cleveland. He has a roughly $42 million decision to make, most of it not guaranteed, with a deadline just days after his court date. Everything about this moment is about closing time, the last contract, the last real shot at a ring, the legacy that's nearly written. And into that delicate, late career calculus dropped a booking photo nobody planned for. Here's the part that will outlast the headline. However the case resolves diversion, deferred adjudication, even a clean dismissal, the arrest itself stays on the record. The law can erase a charge. It cannot erase the fact that it happened. For an ordinary person, that's a private weight. For James Harden, it's a permanent sentence in a story millions of people already know by heart. And maybe that's the most honest takeaway here, the thing the headline never has room to say. Because strip the fame away, and Harden's night is one of the most ordinary legal stories in Texas. The most common version of this exact charge isn't a dangerous criminal, it's a law-abiding person whose gun was visible and unholstered in a vehicle. The MVP and the commuter on the night shift stood in front of the same statute, tripped on the same line, learned the same rule the same hard way. His money bought him a faster bond and a better defense. It did not buy him an exemption. In front of that one specific law, fame bought him nothing at all. So where does that leave us? With more questions than a courtroom can answer. We don't yet know how the case resolves whether the defense unravels it on the very technicality that created it, or whether Harden takes a plea to close the book quickly. We don't know whether the NBA, which has disciplined him before, decides this rises to the level of league concern, or lets the legal process speak for itself. We don't know whether he picks up that option and finishes his career in Cleveland, or whether a single early morning traffic stop quietly nudged a multi-million-dollar decision in some direction we'll only understand in hindsight. All of that is still being written. June 22, June 29, dates that haven't arrived. But underneath the verdict and the contract and the league review, there's a question none of those will ever resolve, and it's the one worth sitting with. How does a man measure the final years of a legacy he spent 2 decades building? when the thing that interrupts it isn't a rival or an injury or a bad shot at the buzzer but a holster he didn't reach for? A future Hall of Famer, weeks removed from the closest he's ever come to a title, brought low not by anything he did on a basketball court, but by a few inches of leather and a law most people never learn until they're standing on the side of a road at 3 in the morning. The game gave James Harden everything except the one thing he wanted most. And in the end, it wasn't the Knicks, or the years, or the misses that put his name in the kind of headline no athlete ever wants. It was a holster that wasn't there.